Welcome to the Mansfield Podcast, your guide to U.S.-Asia policy. Today we speak with Dr. Hilary Holbrow, Assistant Professor of Japanese Politics and Society at Indiana University. Dr. Holbrow is a sociologist by training, and her current scholarship examines social and economic inequality, immigration, and the intersections of gender, race, and ethnicity in Japan.
Okay, and we're joined by Dr. Hilary Holbrow to talk about her work for this week's episode. So, Hilary, we'd like to start off with just kind of briefly introducing what it is that you've been working on, what it is that you're bringing to the U.S.-Japan relationship and Japan studies.
Sure. So what really draws me to Japan as a topic of research is its place at the forefront of this global trend of a population decline. So Japan has had below replacement fertility rates since the mid 1970s. And Japan is not at all unique in that it has these below replacement fertility rates, but it is unique in that this process started much earlier in Japan than it did in other countries. And if we think about our social scientific models of the way that the world works, they're all based on what turns out to have been a very unusual period in human history where the population was growing very rapidly. So Japan is a really interesting example and a place that we can learn from of how is society and economy going to work when we reach the point of population decline. Japan is already at that point. So that's what draws me to study Japan. And I think people tend to look at this question of population decline in a negative way and, worry about how are we going to fund Social Security and so on. But I'm interested in looking at it not just in that light, but also as an opportunity for ways that it might transform society in positive ways.
So to back up for a minute, what first made you interested in Japan, and how did you find your way into this particular area to focus your work on?
So I first became interested in Japan as a middle school student. And I grew up in Germany in part, and I attended an international school there where there were Japanese students. And I was really interested in the lunches that they would bring to school. Which were so much more delicious looking and elaborate than the lunches that I brought. So that just really made me want to learn more about Japan. And I had Japanese friends, and I went to their houses, and they showed me how to write characters in Japanese and so on. And then when I was high school age, my family moved back to the United States, and I ended up attending a very alternative fringe type of free school where there were no classes and no grades. And you pretty much just do whatever you want all day. And I was interested in Japan and in this environment. And I, talked to people at the school about this, and they said, well, there are schools like this in Japan as well. And if you contact the people who run them, maybe you could go there. So the first time I ever went to Japan was as a high school student to visit what in Japan are even more fringe type of schools. And so I just sort of went from there. I've been going back to Japan ever since. And that first introduction, the people who are involved with free schools in Japan tend to be not members of the mainstream. So we have this image of Japanese society, and it's like the traditional family with a housewife mother and a salaryman dad and their kids who are studying really hard for university examinations. And that was not at all the type of people that I interacted with in this first trip to Japan. It was people who had kind of rejected that model of the family and that model of what it means to succeed in your life. And I think getting to see many different aspects of Japanese society and people in these more sort of marginal social positions really made me want to keep going back, because that's something that you're not necessarily exposed to through a traditional exchange program.
Okay, great. So it's fair to say that that introduction shaped how you went into what it is about Japanese society that you wanted to focus on. Can you talk a little bit more about how you went from being an inquisitive middle and high school student into building that career in that direction?
So I continued to study Japanese. I kind of studied it on my own as a high school student and through classes at the Harvard Extension School. And then I went to Boston University for college, continued to study Japanese there. And I had the opportunity as a student to meet and take classes from people who are prominent scholars of Japan. So Professor Mary White, who's a education scholar and food anthropologist, was my senior thesis advisor there. And those experiences as an undergraduate gave me a framework for understanding the experiences that I had as a very naive high school student, and made me want to continue to learn more. After college, I briefly worked for the Japanese embassy in Washington, D.C. I did the JET program. I was a coordinator for international relations in Okinawa, which I learned while I was there, many people consider it to be not Japan. So, I would ask people there in Japan, do you do this and that? And they would say, oh, I don't know. I've never been to Japan. Or the only time I've ever lived in Japan was as a college student. So I can't answer the question. So I got to experience yet another facet of the diversity that is Japanese society there. And then I attended language school in Yokohama and became really committed to the idea of making the study of Japan my career.
Great. So you're working on a book now, and you've got your manuscript in progress. Can you talk a little bit about the central thesis of this book project and what you've been most surprised in working on that?
Yes. So as I said, I think that a really interesting aspect of Japanese society right now is what are the opportunities that are presented by population decline. And one of those opportunities is brought about by the fact that because of population decline, there's a labor shortage in Japan. And that means that historically, people who have been marginalized or excluded in the Japanese labor market actually have potentially at least more opportunities than ever before. And I'm looking particularly in the book at the context of elite firms and Japanese women and immigrant workers, and whether under pressure of population decline, they are now better positioned than in the past to obtain parity with Japanese men in the workplace. And what I find is that, so first of all, as we all know, there's considerable gender inequality in the Japanese workplace. And that appears to be changing very, very slowly. Women in these firms generally do not have very good employment outcomes. They're unlikely to be promoted to management, and their wages are much lower compared to Japanese peers. But one thing that is quite surprising is that immigrants from Asian countries, but also from Western countries, actually, at least in the case of immigrant men, do obtain parity with Japanese men. And I think this is surprising because our image of Japan in the United States is that it is perhaps a uniquely xenophobic society. But it turns out that in elite workplaces, immigrant men actually have a lot of opportunity under the conditions of population decline.
Okay. And so you've written a couple pieces recently published in the Nikkei that draw attention to some of these issues. You have kind of what may seem to be a radical opinion about introducing gender equality in the workplace, that you can't have women solely occupying these assistant level roles. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. So I would say the common sense understanding of how the shortcut to obtaining gender equality in Japan and in the United States is that if you just get more women into management roles, that will transform how women are perceived in the workplace, because it shows that women are capable of leadership. But what I find in the book is that actually women's representation in management doesn't seem to be strongly related to women's overall ability or likelihood of obtaining equality in the workplace. And instead, what seems to really matter for women obtaining equality is to what extent they are the face of low status clerical positions. So when those positions are gender balanced or even dominated by men, outcomes for all women are better. And when those positions are almost exclusively female, then even women in management tend to have quite poor outcomes. So I argue in the book that we have this idea that where biases about gender come from is sort of what we see when we look up the organizational hierarchy, but actually we need to pay much more attention to what people see when they look down. And that is likely even more influential for the overall perception and treatment of women in the workplace.
Interesting. And your most recent Nikkei piece earlier this month is arguing that Japan has achieved successes in boosting birth rates, and that we need to be careful not to overlook those, and that there are lessons to be drawn in other Western countries that are struggling with these declining populations. Talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. So one thing that I like to do in my teaching is really dig into some of these preconceptions that Americans tend to have about Japanese society, things that we just take for granted as the truth, but we don't necessarily have a lot of background knowledge about these topics. And one of these is gender inequality. So we all have this idea in the United States that Japan is just incredibly gender unequal, in contrast to the much more progressive United States. But if you dig a little deeper, there's actually a number of ways in which Japanese society and the Japanese government is more supportive of women than is the US government and US society. And I think the place where that appears the most clearly is Japanese policies on parental leave. So, as you know, in the United States, most people do not have any access to paid parental leave. And if we're lucky, we might have some unpaid parental leave. But in Japan, both women and men actually have access to 12 months or longer of parental leave that is paid at a pretty high rate of their existing salary. And this has contributed to Japan actually having a somewhat higher birth rate than some of its Asian neighbors and most Eastern and Southern European countries. So this is an area where the United States could do far better, and where I think Japan is actually doing pretty well. The women that I study in these companies often have taken parental leaves of 12 months or even 24 months. And that's something that, as from my perspective as a woman working in the United States, that's just unimaginable to me. But I think that ultimately that's good for their families, and that's also very good for society. And now the Japanese government is also making a concerted effort to ensure that men participate in the household and in household labor. And one way they're doing that is encouraging men to take parental leave as well. And while men are still far less likely to do this than women, the government has had some successes in increasing parental leave uptake among men, which ultimately relieves some of the burden from women in the household and can thus contribute to higher fertility rates.
Have you found any difficulties in taking those government policies and seeing them implemented and fully utilized in the private sector? I know there are many unofficial reasons why both men and women don't take the amount of leave that is fully guaranteed to them by law. Can you talk a little bit about some of the struggles of putting that policy into practice?
Yes. This actually relates closely to another theme in my research. And one thing that I have done is basically ask large numbers of employees working in Japanese white collar organizations to evaluate a sort of hypothetical coworker who has just come back from a leave. And what we see is that actually sort of rank and file employees in large companies really penalize coworkers who take leaves. So you have this, hypothetical excellent coworker who took a leave, and if you ask people, does this person deserve to be promoted immediately? 80% of people say yes. If that person has taken a 6-month parental leave, which is actually a pretty short leave as far as Japanese women are concerned, the percentage of people who are willing to recommend them for promotion drops to below 40%. So you can see that there are strong normative barriers within firms that people don't necessarily look on leave taking favorably, even if it is statutorily available to them. So that remains a barrier.
And are there any good news items that you can share? Any ideas that companies are trying to address these normative barriers?
So one thing that was quite surprising in this research is that people talk about the flexibility stigma, which describes what I was just talking about, this idea that people don't evaluate someone who took leave as favorably as someone who did not take leave. And one way that they think about the flexibility stigma is people tend to assume that it's stronger for men than for women. And the reason that they assume this is because men take leave at much lower rates than women. So in the companies that I study, 80 or 90% of women take parental leave when it's available to them, but only fewer than 10% of men do the same. And so people have said, well, the stigma must be really high for men to do this. But one thing that I've uncovered through my research is that actually the stigma is not so high for men to take parental leave. It's actually higher for women to take parental leave than it is for men. So the barriers that men face in taking parental leave are not kind of above and beyond those that women face. And probably the reason that women are more likely to take parental leave is not about lower stigmatization, but more about the fact that they don't have any other options. There's no one else who's going to care for their baby but them. But the good news part of this is that the barriers to encouraging men to take leave are maybe not as high as people would expect based on the currently low share of men who take leave.
That is good news. Yeah. So, a common theme through a lot of your work is the role of immigration, and the pandemic that the world has been experiencing for the last 3+ years now has really drawn an underline of how Japan thinks about immigration and how it thinks about foreigners in general. Can you talk a little bit about where the COVID experience may fit into what Japan is thinking about doing in workplace and immigration efforts?
Yeah, so Japan has really drawn a lot of attention over the course of the pandemic for having very strict border control policy during this time. So, they basically shut down all tourism for almost 3 years. And for some time, they stopped issuing new work visas to foreigners to enter Japan. And this, to many people, confirmed their ideas of Japan as a uniquely xenophobic country in international comparison. But I think that those impressions are not entirely accurate. And so I think what does make Japan really unusual is that in many countries, there is some sort of reluctance or resistance or antagonism towards immigration in the general population. But what Japan has done that other countries haven't necessarily done is really act on that reluctance to accept immigrants. So it's not that the underlying attitudes are different, but that the attitudes are actually reflected in policy. So you can see this particularly in the case of high-skilled immigrants versus immigrants who come to do sort of low-paid work in agriculture, manufacturing, and services. And Japan, over the past 30 years, has been very eager to welcome migrants who are going to work in white-collar jobs in elite companies like the ones I study, while placing a lot of restrictions on entry for people who are coming to work in low-paid jobs. And many people have taken this as evidence of Japan's unique xenophobia. But if you actually look at attitudes in international comparison, this is actually the policy that citizens of most countries want. It's what people in the United States want. It's what people in Western Europe want. And Japan is unusual, not in that that's what citizens want, but that the policy has actually reflected that, as opposed to a business's demand for labor whom they can pay very low wages. But because of this issue of population decline, I think this is inevitably going to change in Japan. And the profile of the typical immigrant in Japan is going to become more diverse, and just under these pressures of population decline, Japan is necessarily going to have to accept more immigrants at all levels of the occupational hierarchy. So I think we can look to, in the future, Japan looking increasingly normal or typical in terms of its immigrant population.
So what are the policies that we should be expecting to see in that movement? Is it specialized visa classifications? Is it a wholesale move to what other Western nations are doing in terms of their immigration policy? How might this shift look for those of us who are watching Japanese policy?
So one thing is that I think that changing these policies is incredibly difficult. There is an allergy to what some scholars have referred to as the I word, the word immigration in Japan, right? People are actually happy to accept foreigners as long as they can consider them foreign workers and not immigrants. That is to say, people who are going to settle long-term in Japan. And I think likely what we're going to see in the short to medium term is actually not huge movement in terms of policy to change that, but rather increasing uptake by businesses of the policies that are already in place. So this is another huge misconception that I think people have about Japan, that it's incredibly difficult to emigrate there for everyone. But the fact is, Japan is actually more open towards white collar immigration than is the United States. So much of our white collar immigration in the United States takes place through this H-1B visa, which a lot of tech workers have. But there's a limited number of those available every year, and it's hugely oversubscribed. So it ends up being a lottery, and many of these visas get, sort of snatched up by the big tech companies. And Japan doesn't have any quotas at all. So to the extent that Japanese businesses want to hire foreign workers, they can already do so. And I think we're just going to see more and more uptake of that in the absence of these quotas like we have in the United States.
Interesting. So it wouldn't be so much a policy change from the government as an appetite change from industry.
Yes, exactly. And I did a calculation a couple years ago that just looked at the increase in foreigners living in Japan over time and kind of projecting this into the future. And what I found was that by 2040 or 2050, even if the trajectory just continues the way it's going now, so without any further policy changes, by 2040 and 2050, you can expect about 10% of Japan's population to be non-citizens. And that's actually quite comparable to the share of foreign-born in many European countries today. The share of foreign-born in the United States is only around 13 or 14% or so. So this is without any policy change, just through this appetite from industry. Japanese society is inevitably going to become considerably more diverse over the coming decades.
Great. I'm just making this note for myself later. I'm probably going to use that as the pull quote to start this. That's great. Thanks. So we were happy to have you participate in cohort 5 of the Network for the Future program. Can you talk a little bit about what you learned through that experience and how that might come to light in your future work as you move through your career?
So one thing where I've really benefited tremendously from the network is in thinking about how to reach a broader audience with my work. And the network has very directly connected me with opportunities to do that. So, for example, my fellow cohort member, John Bradford, is involved with the Yokosuka Council on Asia Pacific Studies. And because we know each other through the network, he invited me to give a talk in his Getting to Know Japan series, which is for a very broad general audience, including many service people in the US military who are in Japan. So this is an audience that I wouldn't normally reach through, an academic article that I write, and these people aren't students in my courses or anything like that. But I found it really satisfying and helpful to me to be able to reach that audience. And then that also led to further opportunities. Then the US Embassy in Japan invited me to give a talk about gender roles in Japan to all the consular and embassy staff. Once again, that's an audience that I wouldn't have been able to reach except through these connections forged through the network. I've also, as you mentioned, I've written twice for Nikkei Asia over the past couple months, and that's not something that I would have done except for the network. And just seeing people from the general public responding to my work and having an opportunity to, as I said, correct some of those misconceptions that people tend to hold about Japan has been immensely rewarding.
Great, thanks. And while our listeners and myself wait for your book project to be completed, is there a single book or are there reading materials that you would advise interested listeners to look into, folks who maybe don't have an advanced training in this field but want to learn more about it?
Sure. So one book that I assign in my undergraduate classes that I think is just fascinating if you're interested in immigration to Japan. It's a 2010 book by Tessa Morris Suzuki. It is called Borderline Japan. And it is about the hidden history of migration to and from Japan in the immediate post-war period. And one really fascinating bit of history that she uncovers in this book is to what extent Japan's current restrictive migration policy, that is restrictive towards people who are not engaged in high paid work, to what extent that was actually designed and implemented by the Allied and US-led occupation in Japan. So it was actually, in some cases, American bureaucrats who were designing this immigration policy that now Japan gets faulted for as being, xenophobic and restrictive and so on. But we as Americans actually played a heavy hand in shaping that policy.
Great. And there's going to be a link to that book in the description for this podcast. But thank you again, Dr. Holbrow, for your enlightening discussion and helping us kind of correct some of those misconceptions we have about gender in Japan, about immigration policy in Japan, about the workforce in Japan. Thank you again.
Thanks, Tim.
More information about Dr. Holbrow's work, including a link to the article discussed in this podcast, is available in the description. Please join us next time for a discussion on geopolitics and the Japan-South Korea relationship with Dr. Anand Rao of SUNY Geneseo. This season of the Mansfield podcast is made possible with support from the Japan Foundation. Special thanks to Nick Velez for editing support. Music is courtesy of Laura Schwartz and Bellwether Bayou. On behalf of the entire Mansfield Foundation, I've been your host, Tim White. Thank you, and we hope you'll join us again soon.